Hi, I'm Ben. I'm the youth pastor at the Point Church, and I want to welcome you to session 2. We're going to be looking at the Torah, but before we jump into that, I just want to share a little bit about my journey with the Bible. So I remember in year 11 sitting in GCSE English classes, learning all of these poems about war and childhood and other obscure topics. And I remember the teacher explaining things about the language, the number of lines, the symbolism that the poet used to mean things that we didn't understand when we first read it. And I remember my teacher explaining that the reason that we studied poetry was to uncover some of this stuff that we couldn't see right away at the beginning. At the time, I remember being really skeptical and thinking, surely this is just made up. Surely it's wishful thinking that we're reading stuff into these poems that the writer didn't intend at all. And I remember the more that I learned about these things, the less skeptical I became, and the more amazed I was at the depth of what I was seeing before me. And I realised that if we understand particular things about what we're looking at, like its genre, like its context, its setting, its purpose, why it's there at all, then what we have in front of us has a lot more meaning. And I've come to find that exactly the same is true with the Bible, especially with the Old Testament, where things can seem a little bit muddled and don't make sense at first. That when we understand more of what we're reading, then the Old Testament can come to life. So let's jump into the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. That is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, you might not be familiar with the word Torah, and the reason for that is because it's the Jewish name of these collection of books, which we as Christians sometimes call the Pentateuch. Now, these books in the Old Testament make up what's called the Jewish or the Hebrew Bible, which existed by itself long before it was part of the Christian Bible that we now read today. Now, Jesus was a Jew, and so he would have been really familiar with these books, and these were integral to the way that he lived his life and the way that he saw the world. And so it's part of Jesus' journey, and so must be part of our journey and our understanding too. Now, traditionally, Moses was seen to be the writer of the Torah. But today, the main view is that whilst Moses was definitely involved in writing parts of the Torah, the other parts of it were written by other people, and then later it was all edited together to see what we have in front of us now. Now, as a storyline from Genesis through to Deuteronomy, we see a story of God persistently pursuing a relationship with the people of Israel, and those people just continually getting things wrong over and over again. So let's start looking at the books. In Genesis, right at the beginning of the Hebrew Bible, we see that God is responsible for everything that's created. We see a picture of Adam and Eve living in the Garden of Eden in perfect harmony with what's around them. However, that doesn't last long, and so Adam and Eve choose to do things their own way, which is against the way that God has called them to live, and that pretty much sets the tone for the whole of the Old Testament. We see through people like Noah and Abraham and his descendants, God make promise after promise, promising to bless them as long as they kept up their end of the deal as well. But they continually get it wrong, they muck up, until we come to the person of Joseph. Now, Joseph has almost got the opposite deal. Joseph is treated terribly by people. He's sold as a slave into Egypt by his own family. But he responds in a way that honours God, and so he finds favour and blessing with God. And his actions ultimately lead to Egypt and Israel being saved. And that's where we come to the end of Genesis. We see Joseph's family, the sons of Israel, coming to live in Egypt. Now, from the end of Genesis to the beginning of Exodus, 400 years pass, and we see a very different situation. The people of Israel have multiplied, they've become really successful, but we're introduced to Egypt's Pharaoh, who is presented as the worst person in the Bible so far, and he feels threatened by Israel, and so begins to persecute them. It's at this time that Moses is introduced as someone who's actually an Israelite, but raised as an Egyptian. And God calls Moses to save Israel. And so with God's help through amazing miracles, God saves the people through Moses, and Moses leads them out of Egypt. This is where the name Exodus of the book comes from. Now, the rest of Exodus, we see God continuing to make this two-way promise or covenant with his holy people, the people of Israel. But their response is far from new. And as soon as they've signed up to this promise and they've made all these promises to God, they instantly muck up and go against it. However, God honours his promise, and he makes a new way for them to repair the damage and to encounter his promise once again. And this is what Leviticus is all about. This third book is all about explaining how they can do that. And so it contains a whole list of different laws and instructions about how they should live, how they can be God's holy people once again. They're told how they can build a tent or a tabernacle, which will be where God's presence is. They're taught all about how to be priests, what sacrifices about, how to stay pure and holy, and the whole thing is designed to express God's call for Israel to be faithful. Then the next book, Numbers, begins with the census, and then it speaks about these spies that are sent out to the land that God has promised them. However, these spies forget about all that God has done in saving them, and so become fearful of entering this new land in case they're defeated. And so as a result, God tells the people that they're not going to enter this promised land, but instead they're going to wander the wilderness for 40 years, and that it will be their children, a new generation, that will enter the promised land. And that's where we come to the end of Numbers, this generation preparing to enter the promised land. And then finally, Deuteronomy consists as a series of speeches that Moses gives to this new generation before they enter the promised land. He reminds them of how to keep the laws, and he adds in a few new ones too. And it's all about how, again, to be faithful to God. Moses outlines the consequences of what should happen if they succeed or if they fail to do this. And he urges them to choose life over death. However, his hopes aren't high, and Moses knows that it's unlikely after all this time that Israel is suddenly going to get it right. But before he dies, Moses declares that God will transform Israel's heart so that they're able to live a way that brings life and they can have hope once again. Now, the Torah is just the beginning of understanding God's pursuit after his people. This room that I'm sitting in is part of an old manor house in the south of England. And this isn't the biggest room in the manor, but it's the most valuable. The reason for that is because the wallpaper that you can just see behind me is laced with gold. If you were to remove the wallpaper from this room, then the whole room's worth would be lost as well. And the Bible is exactly the same. The more that we appreciate the Bible and we can read particular things according to its genre, its context, and its purpose, the more that we can uncover its value. When we understand that the Old Testament and the Torah is all about God's pursuit for a relationship with mankind, and it points to Jesus as the ultimate expression of this, then we discover the true treasures of gold that are laced in the pages of the Bible. Now, I hope that's helpful to you, and that makes sense and is able to help you appreciate the Bible a little bit more and see the wonders that it contains. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the course as well.